What if a decorated soldier, a man who dedicated his life to serving his country, was treated like a criminal simply because of the color of his skin? What if the uniform that should have commanded respect was stripped away in public humiliation? And what if the only thing that saved him was a crowd that refused to stay silent? Tonight, we bring you the powerful story of Major Elijah Brooks, a man who stood tall in the face of disrespect, discrimination, and injustice, and the shocking turn of events that followed. Tell us in the comments where you're watching from and if this story moved you. And don't forget to subscribe to Inspiring Stories Told, because these stories need to be heard. The storm outside rumbled low and menacing, distant lightning flashing like warning beacons beyond the massive windows of Dallas-Fort Worth International Airport. Rain streaked across the glass, blurring the city skyline in the background. The airport, like always, was a chaotic orchestra of movement, families dragging suitcases, businessmen glued to their phones, last-minute travelers jogging toward closing gates. The tension in the air wasn't just from the impending storm. It was the kind of night where things felt on edge, where one wrong move could set something in motion that couldn't be undone. Major Elijah Brooks stepped inside, his polished boots clicking against the tiled floor. The weight of his uniform settled on his shoulders, not just the fabric, but the history stitched into it. His chest bore years of service, medals of honor, sacrifices made, battles fought, and yet, as he walked toward the check-in counter, he was well aware that none of it would shield him from the battle ahead. Tonight's mission wasn't in a war zone. It wasn't in a foreign land or a classified operation deep in hostile territory. No, this mission was about respect, dignity, and the silent duty every soldier carries to bring a fallen brother home. Tightening his grip on his briefcase and military orders, Elijah exhaled slowly. Private Anthony Cole, barely 22 years old, had given everything to his country. The least Elijah could do was ensure he made it back to his family, back to the place that raised him, back to the soil that he fought for. The airport buzzed with announcements, rolling suitcases, and casual chatter, but the moment Elijah reached the check-in counter, the energy shifted. Behind the counter stood Margaret Holloway, a thin woman with sharp features and cold eyes that scanned people as if weighing their worth before even speaking. She was dressed in a crisp airline uniform, her name tag gleaming, but her expression was void of warmth. Elijah placed his orders and ID on the counter. Major Elijah Brooks, escorting the remains of Private Anthony Cole. Flight 372 to Atlanta. His tone was calm, authoritative, the kind of voice that carried weight in military briefings, in classified discussions where words meant everything. Margaret barely glanced at him before picking up his papers with 2 fingers, as if they carried some invisible stain. She typed into the system, her expression unchanged until it wasn't. A slight pause, a flicker of hesitation, an unreadable shift in her eyes before she masked it with indifference. Her fingers hovered over the keyboard, but she didn't type anything else. Instead, she exhaled sharply through her nose, then looked up, her lips pressing into a thin line. "Sir, there seems to be an issue with your reservation." The way she said "sir" wasn't out of respect. It was a formality wrapped in a layer of condescension. Elijah straightened. "What kind of issue?" Margaret glanced over her shoulder at her coworker, another uniformed employee who was pretending not to listen but very much aware of the exchange. She leaned slightly, whispered something under her breath. The other employee, a middle-aged man with graying hair, darted a glance at Elijah, then gave a small shake of his head, as if telling Margaret to be careful. Elijah's jaw tightened. He had been through enough of these moments to recognize the signs, the furtive glances, the careful wording, the vague delay tactics. Margaret turned back to him, her voice smoother now, but forced. "One moment, sir." Without another word, she stepped away, taking his documents with her. The line behind Elijah grew impatient. A couple shifted their suitcases, a teenage girl sighed dramatically, and a businessman tapped his expensive watch, irritated. Elijah didn't move. He stood tall, shoulders squared, his presence unshakable even as the people behind him grumbled. Minutes passed. Too many minutes. When Margaret returned, her expression was neutral, too neutral. A mask. The kind of neutrality that hid something unpleasant beneath it. "I'm sorry, sir," she said, but there was no real apology in her tone. "You won't be able to board this flight." Elijah blinked, the weight of the words settling in his chest like lead. "Excuse me." Margaret's smile was tight, brittle, like she had rehearsed it in a mirror but never quite perfected it. "There are some security concerns. We can't allow you to board at this time." The air shifted again. The people in line who had been mildly irritated before were now fully alert. A mother clutched her child's hand a little tighter. A man holding his boarding pass frowned. Elijah's heart pounded, but his face remained unreadable. Years of discipline kept him composed. He had faced worse than this, far worse. "Security concerns," he repeated, his voice steady. "My documentation is valid. I have military orders, and I'm on an official assignment." Margaret simply nodded, offering no further explanation. "I understand, sir. But this is policy." That word, policy. Elijah had seen policy used as a weapon before, as a shield for discrimination, as an excuse for denying people their dignity. A tension-filled silence stretched between them. The people behind him were watching closely now. Then, a voice from the line, laced with irritation, "Just follow the rules like everyone else." Elijah turned his head slightly. A white businessman, dressed in an expensive navy suit, adjusted his tie, clearly annoyed that his wait was being extended. It was a familiar statement, one Elijah had heard too many times in too many places. Just follow the rules. As if the rules had ever been written for people like him. The first cut of humiliation settled into his skin, but he didn't let it show. He turned back to Margaret. "Let me speak to a supervisor." Her eyes flickered with something, annoyance, hesitation, maybe fear. But she didn't move. Elijah didn't move either. A subtle shift in the atmosphere. A storm was brewing, and it wasn't just outside. People weren't just waiting anymore. They were watching, and Elijah Brooks was not going anywhere. The terminal had gone silent. The kind of silence that wasn't peaceful but loaded, charged, expectant, like a battlefield right before the first shot was fired. Major Elijah Brooks stood tall, unwavering, but inside, something deep and familiar burned. A cold, simmering frustration that only men like him understood. He had earned his place, his rank, his dignity through sacrifice, yet here he was, treated as if none of it mattered. Margaret Holloway still hadn't moved. She knew what she had done, and so did Elijah. Then, without a word, she reached for her radio, pressing a button. Her voice was clipped, professional, but dripping with something else, authority wielded like a knife. "Security to check-in counter 6. Immediate response needed." A few murmurs rippled through the crowd. Passengers exchanged glances. A woman clutched her purse a little tighter. A man shifted uncomfortably. It didn't take long. A figure emerged from the far end of the terminal. Officer Chad Winters, airport security. Even from a distance, his posture said everything. His hand rested casually on the handle of his taser as he walked with deliberate slowness, a smirk already pulling at the corners of his mouth. Elijah had seen that look before. The look of a man who knew he had power. The look of a man who enjoyed using it. Winters reached the counter, his eyes scanning Elijah from head to toe, lingering on the uniform, the medals, the rigid stance. But his smirk didn't fade. If anything, it grew. "Step aside, sir," Winters said, voice mockingly polite, but too loud, meant for the onlookers more than for Elijah himself. Elijah didn't flinch. "I'd like to know exactly what policy prevents me from boarding this flight." Winters tilted his head, pretending to consider. Then, after a pause, he let out a short chuckle, shaking his head. "Don't question authority, sir. If you're not hiding anything, you'll comply." The words settled like stones in Elijah's chest. It wasn't a request. It was a trap. He had been in too many rooms like this before, the ones where his patience was tested, his dignity poked and prodded like a caged animal. He had spent his life walking the tightrope, knowing that one wrong move, one flash of anger, could give them the excuse they were waiting for. But Elijah Brooks was not going to break for them. He inhaled slowly. Comply with what? Exactly? Winter's smirk widened. He leaned in slightly, voice dipped just low enough for only Elijah to hear. You think that uniform makes you different? It doesn't. The air cracked around them. Elijah's fists clenched at his sides, but he stayed still, his jaw locked so tightly it ached. Winter straightened, clearing his throat. Sir, as part of enhanced airport security measures, we need to conduct a search. Standard procedure. Standard procedure. The two words were so empty, so rehearsed, that Elijah nearly laughed. But there was nothing funny about what was about to happen. Winters turned to the two younger officers who had arrived at his side, gesturing toward Elijah like he was an object, not a man. Let's make this quick, Winters ordered. Jacket. Shoes. Hat. Elijah's stomach turned. There was no way this was happening. Passengers had begun to whisper, some pulling out their phones. A few started recording. Are you serious? A woman's voice cut through the tension. A man beside her muttered, This isn't right. Elijah locked eyes with Winters. This is unnecessary. Winters only shrugged. If you've got nothing to hide, you won't mind, right? Elijah had a choice now. He could stand his ground and escalate this into something dangerous. Or he could strip down and endure this final humiliation, knowing there were bigger battles ahead. He exhaled sharply, then removed his uniform jacket. A hushed gasp rippled through the crowd as he folded the heavy fabric carefully, setting it on the counter. His medals, his insignia, his rank, all stripped away in an instant. Next, his shoes, his hat, his dignity, piece by piece. The room had gone eerily quiet now. A woman pressed her hand to her mouth, shaking her head. A man in a hoodie held his phone higher, capturing every second. But Winters was not finished. He gestured toward the small, sterile-looking room near the corner of the terminal. Now step inside for further questioning. Further questioning. Elijah knew what that meant. No cameras. No witnesses. No evidence. Winters turned slightly, his smug grin barely contained. Unless, of course, you'd rather make a scene out here? Elijah's breath felt tight in his chest. He had faced death before. He had survived enemy fire, war zones, missions no one knew about. And yet, this moment, this very public stripping of his identity, felt like a wound he wouldn't easily forget. He turned to Margaret Holloway, still standing behind the counter, watching, saying nothing. This was what she had wanted. Not to deny him his flight. To deny him his humanity. Elijah squared his shoulders. He would not give them the satisfaction of breaking. He stepped toward the interrogation room. Inside, the air was cold, sterile, suffocating. Winters shut the door behind him. No cameras. No recording. Just him and Elijah. The officer leaned against the table, crossing his arms, smirking like he had already won. Men like you always think you're special, Winters muttered. But you're just another guy in a uniform. Take it off, and what's left? Elijah stared at him, expression unreadable. He wasn't going to give this man a single inch. Winters sighed dramatically. You think all this noise outside will save you? The moment you walk out, they'll forget. But you won't. Elijah let the words settle. Then he leaned forward slightly, his voice low, unshaken. You think this uniform makes me? It doesn't. But it sure as hell reminds me who the enemy is. Winters' smirk faltered, just slightly. A knock on the door. Winters jerked his head up, annoyed. Another security officer poked his head in. You might want to come out here. Winters scowled. Why? The officer's eyes darted to Elijah. His expression was different. Uneasy. Nervous. Because people are watching. Winters frowned and turned to the door, but Elijah already knew. He could feel it in his chest. Outside this room, the world was waiting, and this story was far from over. How does this make you feel? Watching a decorated soldier, who has given everything for his country, be humiliated, stripped of his dignity, and treated like a criminal? If it weren't for the cameras, the witnesses, and the whispers of outrage, how much further would they have gone? How many times has this happened to someone without a uniform to shield them, without a crowd to bear witness? Would Elijah's rank have mattered if no one had been watching? And here's the real question. If respect for service isn't guaranteed, what does that say about justice for everyone else? When Elijah Brooks stepped out of the interrogation room, the energy in the terminal had shifted, palpable, heavy, waiting. He could feel it in his bones. It wasn't just about him anymore. It was bigger now. A storm had begun, and this time, it wasn't just the one raging outside. As Officer Winters shut the door behind him, smug as ever, a deep voice cut through the air, loud and firm, the kind that demanded attention. "This is a disgrace." The terminal fell silent. All eyes turned toward the source, an older man, broad-shouldered, weathered face, and a proud Marine Corps hat pulled low over his brow. Sergeant Lucas Carter, retired Marine, Vietnam veteran, and a man who had seen enough injustice to recognize it immediately. His voice was steady, unshaken, filled with the kind of authority that came from having fought for the very freedoms being trampled right in front of him. "That man is a soldier," he said, taking a step forward. "And he's being treated like a criminal. In his own country." The words hit like a hammer. A ripple of murmurs spread. A woman near the counter clutched her chest, shaking her head. A teenage boy raised his phone higher, recording every second. Sergeant Carter wasn't done. "I don't care what excuse they give you," he growled, eyes locking onto Officer Winters and Margaret Holloway. "I've seen this before. I know exactly what this is." Winters shifted slightly, the smirk on his face faltering for the first time. Elijah met the Marine's eyes. And in that moment, without a single word, he knew he wasn't alone. People started shuffling closer, their expressions hardening, their phones held high. Passengers had been watching before, but now they were documenting. Aggressively, a woman in a denim jacket whispered fiercely to her husband. "This isn't just about him anymore," she muttered. "This is about all of us." A college student in a hoodie typed furiously into his phone. A few seconds later, he looked up, his face unreadable. "It's already trending," he muttered. Then, from the far side of the terminal, someone pushed forward, moving fast. A young woman, dark curls bouncing, a camera slung across her shoulder, eyes sharp as a blade. Isabella Izzy Martinez, a rising journalist, social media activist, and the last person the airline wanted to see right now. She pulled out her phone without hesitation, hit live, and started broadcasting. "I want everyone watching this right now to understand what's happening," she said, her voice smooth, urgent, practiced. She turned the camera toward Elijah, his stripped uniform, the humiliation still fresh on his face. "This is Major Elijah Brooks, a decorated soldier, a man who has served his country with honor. He was supposed to be on a flight escorting the remains of a fallen soldier. But instead, he was just dragged into an interrogation room, stripped of his dignity, treated like a threat." Her voice hardened, her eyes burning. Why? Because of a policy they won't even name. Passengers around her nodded, murmuring in agreement. She turned the camera toward Officer Winters, zooming in on his tight jaw, his clenched fists. "Officer Winters," she said smoothly, her tone sharp as a knife. "Would you like to explain to the American people why you just humiliated a soldier in front of an entire airport?" Winters turned away. But it was too late. The video had already begun spreading like wildfire. Within minutes, social media erupted. Hashtag let him fly, hashtag respect our soldiers, hashtag veterans deserve better. A storm of tweets, reposts, comments, and outrage poured in. Veterans organizations weighed in within minutes. A statement from the United Veterans Alliance appeared on Twitter. "This treatment of a U.S. soldier is unacceptable. We stand with Major Elijah Brooks. At Airline name, we demand an explanation." A black congressional leader posted, "Disrespecting our servicemen? Discrimination wrapped in policy? We see it, and we won't ignore it." Hashtag let him fly. Margaret Holloway's face had gone pale. She disappeared behind a frosted glass door, likely scrambling for damage control. Officer Winters, once so smug, so confident, stiffened as his radio buzzed. "Chad, you need to shut this down now," a voice crackled through. "We've got corporate calling. The CEO's office wants a full report immediately." Winters cursed under his breath. He wasn't in control anymore. Through it all, Elijah remained still. He had endured the worst of it, but now he was watching the tide turn. But he knew better than to relax. They still hadn't let him go. still hadn't cleared him for his flight. And that meant the fight wasn't over. Izzy turned the camera back on herself, her expression fierce. I want to ask every single person watching this, what happens next? Are we going to let this go? Are we going to let another story like this fade away, buried under corporate apologies and PR stunts? She turned back to Elijah, her voice thick with emotion. Because I guarantee you, if no one was recording, Major Brooks would have been thrown out of this airport in silence. Forgotten. She stepped closer, her voice almost a whisper now, but no less powerful. And if they can do this to a man who wore the uniform, what do you think they do to people who don't? The screen exploded with comments. We will not be silent. Boycott this airline. He served our country. We stand with Major Brooks. In the distance, Elijah spotted a group of security officers whispering frantically. Margaret Holloway had not returned, and Winters was gripping his radio so tightly his knuckles had turned white. This was the moment where either the system would crush Elijah or the people would force it to change. And this time, the world was watching. When Elijah Brooks stepped back into the terminal, it was like stepping into the eye of a storm, but this time, it wasn't his storm to endure alone. A wall of angry, determined faces met him. Phones raised high, recording. Whispers and murmurs turning into an undeniable, deafening presence. The people had not moved on. They had not looked away. And now, they were waiting. Winters followed behind him, his jaw tight, his shoulders squared, but the cocky arrogance from earlier was gone. Margaret Holloway had returned, but she wasn't the same woman who had dismissed him before. Her hands trembled as she clutched a tablet, her eyes darting to the crowd, to the phones, to the screens lighting up with thousands, no, millions, of people watching. She had lost control, and she knew it. Margaret cleared her throat, but her voice came out weaker than she intended. Major Brooks, after reviewing the situation, we've reconsidered. She forced a strained, unnatural smile, as if that could undo what had just happened. We'll get you on first class immediately. A hush settled over the crowd, anticipation thick in the air. All eyes turned to Elijah. Would he accept it? Would he let them quietly sweep this under the rug? Or would he stand his ground? He knew what they were doing. They were scrambling, trying to contain the disaster before it spread further, trying to buy back their reputation with an upgrade and a smile. Elijah exhaled slowly, then lifted his head. He stood taller than he ever had before. And then, in a voice that was steady, strong, and unshakable, he answered, I don't need first class. The crowd leaned in. The tension spiked. Margaret blinked, confused. This wasn't in the script. Elijah's next words were clear, crisp, and undeniable. I need respect. The crowd exploded. Passengers clapped, whistled, cheered. Sergeant Lucas Carter let out a low, approving grunt, nodding in admiration. Izzy Martinez captured it all, her live stream climbing past 2 million viewers. The chant started as a whisper, but it grew. Respect, respect, respect. Margaret's face drained of all color. Winters stepped back slightly, for the first time looking genuinely unsure of what to do. The airline's nightmare had officially begun. Then it happened. A new voice cut through the chaos. One that was calm, yet commanding. This situation is over. Silence fell like a hammer. The crowd parted instinctively, as if sensing that real power had entered the room. And then, stepping forward, his posture rigid, his eyes like steel, came a man in a sharply pressed military uniform, for stars glinting on his shoulders. Major General Robert Hayes. Elijah's breath caught for just a second. He knew Hayes, respected him. The man was a legend, and he did not show up unless things were about to change. Margaret and Winters stiffened, eyes widening. They recognized the name. The United States Army had just entered the chat, and they weren't here to play games. Hayes surveyed the room, his gaze sweeping over the situation in a way that made it clear he understood everything without a single explanation. His expression hardened as he turned toward Margaret. We've already spoken to the Pentagon, he said, his voice edged with authority. Major Brooks will not be flying commercial. Margaret swallowed hard, shifting uncomfortably. Sir, Hayes lifted a hand, cutting her off. No, you had your chance to do the right thing. You chose not to. We're done here. Margaret visibly withered under the weight of his words. Hayes turned back to Elijah. Your transport is waiting, Major. Elijah blinked, then nodded sharply. This was bigger than an upgrade to first class. This was a statement. The U.S. military had just overridden the airline's authority. Passengers watched as a group of uniformed men entered the terminal, parting the crowd like a wave. Izzy's camera zoomed in on the private military jet, waiting just beyond the glass windows, its sleek frame glowing under the airport floodlights. A jet meant for dignitaries, for war heroes, for men who deserved respect. And tonight, it was for Major Elijah Brooks. The moment hit like a seismic shift. Passengers cheered wildly as Elijah turned and began walking toward the exit, toward the transport he deserved. Sergeant Lucas Carter gave him a firm, proud nod. Izzy wiped at her eyes before turning her camera to herself. America, she said, voice thick with emotion. This is how you stand up. This is how you hold people accountable. But before Elijah reached the door, a voice cut through the commotion. Excuse me. Margaret Holloway flinched as a man in a crisp suit approached her, holding an official document. Corporate security. The airline's higher-ups had been watching. The man's expression was cold, professional, merciless. Miss Holloway, you're being placed on immediate administrative leave pending further investigation. Margaret opened her mouth, but no words came out. This wasn't just about one flight anymore. This was a corporate crisis. She had become the scapegoat. And as she watched Elijah walk away, she knew she had just lost everything. As Elijah reached the private jet, he turned one last time. The crowd was still chanting. Winters was gone. Margaret was frozen in place, staring at the ground. Hayes extended his hand, a silent but powerful gesture of respect. Elijah took it. And as the private jet door closed behind him, the final chapter of this fight had been written. But the war for justice? That fight would never be over. The roar of the engines thrummed beneath Elijah Brooks' feet as he ascended the short flight of steps to the private military jet. The crisp night air bit at his skin, but he barely felt it. This wasn't just about him anymore. It never had been. As he reached the entrance, a young soldier stood at attention, his uniform pristine, his posture rigid with respect. His eyes, however, held something deeper, a mix of admiration, apology, and silent understanding. The soldier raised his hand in a sharp salute. Sir, welcome aboard. For a split second, Elijah hesitated. Not because he didn't belong here, but because it shouldn't have taken all of this to prove that he did. With a measured breath, he returned the salute and stepped inside. His mission was back on track. But the war for justice was just beginning. By the time Elijah's flight left the tarmac, the world had already exploded. News networks had seized the footage, broadcasting the incident on every major channel. The headline was blunt, undeniable. Decorated black soldier denied flight. Humiliated in unjust airport incident, military intervenes. Video clips of Elijah being forced to remove his uniform, Winter's smug face, Margaret Holloway's panicked expression, and General Hayes' powerful arrival flooded the internet. The hashtags #LetHimFly, #RespectOurSoldiers, and #JusticeForElijah trended worldwide. The public was outraged. Veterans organizations released official statements, condemning the airline in the strongest terms possible. Politicians weighed in. A U.S. senator tweeted, "Every soldier who wears the uniform deserves respect. Major Brooks, we see you. We stand with you. And we won't let this slide." Celebrities joined in. A well-known talk show host posted, "First class wasn't the problem. The problem was racism hiding behind policy." Let's be real about that. The airline's damage control was failing before it even started. By morning, the airline's stock had plummeted. Investors were scrambling. The board of directors held an emergency meeting as their public relations team worked overtime to craft a statement. But it was too late. Lawsuits were already being filed. Veteran advocacy groups launched a full-scale investigation into discriminatory practices and airline policies. A class action lawsuit formed, with other service members stepping forward with their own horror stories of racial profiling at airports. Then came the biggest blow. The airline lost a lucrative government contract, worth millions. A retired general publicly announced that the Pentagon was reviewing all future business dealings with the company. The message was clear. They hadn't just disrespected one soldier. They had disrespected them all. Meanwhile, the faces of this injustice were paying the price. Margaret Holloway was officially fired, her decades-long career shattered overnight. A leaked internal memo revealed the airline was using her as a scapegoat, citing her as a rogue employee who had violated company values. Winters didn't fare any better. The footage of him smirking, whispering racist remarks to Elijah, and reveling in his abuse of power became one of the most damning pieces of evidence in the case. By the end of the week, he was no longer employed at the airport. His career in security? Over. When Elijah finally landed, the moment was bittersweet. He had won this battle, but not without scars. The fight had drained him. Yet, as he stepped onto the tarmac, he saw Private Anthony Cole's family waiting. A mother clutching a folded flag, tears streaming down her face. A father standing tall, though his hands trembled at his sides. And suddenly, everything else faded. The humiliation, the anger, the injustice, it all became secondary to this one moment. Because this was why he fought. Not for recognition, not for social media trends, but for the ones who never made it home. He approached the family, his heart heavy, but his resolve unbreakable. And as he handed over the remains of their son, he whispered words that weren't just for them, but for every soldier who had ever been disrespected, discarded, or denied their rightful place. He was never alone. A pause, a deep breath, and neither are we. The battle against injustice was far from over. For every victory, there were 100 more fights waiting. But Elijah had learned something crystal clear that night. Silence lets injustice grow. And when good people stand together, injustice has nowhere to hide. The story of Major Elijah Brooks is more than just an isolated incident. It is a reflection of something much bigger, something that happens every day to people who don't have cameras watching, who don't have a crowd speaking up for them, who don't have the power to fight back. How many injustices go unseen simply because they don't make headlines? How many people have been humiliated, denied their dignity, and forced to accept unfair treatment because no one was there to capture it, to expose it, to demand accountability? This isn't just about one soldier in an airport. It's about all of us. It's about the way power is used and abused, about the way rules and policies are weaponized against those who are deemed less important, less deserving, less worthy of respect. But here's the truth: respect should never be a privilege. It should be the standard. Elijah's journey didn't just highlight his resilience. It showed the power of collective voices. What started as one man being humiliated turned into a nationwide movement because people refused to stay silent. The passengers who spoke up, the journalists who broadcasted the injustice, the veterans who refused to let their brother be disrespected, they made the difference. They proved that silence protects injustice, but when people stand together, injustice has nowhere to hide. And that's where you come in. This story is a call to action, a reminder that what happened to Elijah could happen to anyone. The next time you witness unfairness, will you look away? Will you convince yourself it's not your problem? Or will you be like Lucas Carter, the Marine who stood up? Like Izzy Martinez, the journalist who refused to let the story be buried? Will you use your voice to make sure justice is not optional? If this story made you feel anger, frustration, sadness, good. That means you care. That means you see the brokenness in the system, and more importantly, you see the power to change it. Because change doesn't start with politicians or CEOs. It starts with people like us, ordinary people refusing to accept injustice as normal. So if you believe in what Elijah stood for, in dignity, in respect, in fairness, then show your support. Like this video to stand with him. Share it so others can see the truth. Subscribe to this channel so you never miss a story that challenges, inspires, and exposes the reality of the world we live in. Because this is only the beginning. There are more stories to tell, more battles to fight, more voices that need to be heard. And together, we will continue to shine a light on injustice until the day comes when stories like Elijah's are no longer necessary. So stay with us, speak up, and never let silence be an option.